Welcome to another session of BHY Solutions. We're diving into it's this fascinating debate, really, in Iranian architecture.
Yeah. The intensity of it, I mean, it really jumps out at you.
It does, yeah.
It tells you a lot about how invested people are in their work.
Right.
Yeah.
So we're looking at this disagreement that started when architect Bahram Shirdel, he had some pretty strong criticism of the Museum of Contemporary Art in Tehran, MOCAT, and to a lesser extent, the City Theater.
Uh-huh.
His main point, which he made in an online interview, is that MOCAT is, well, a lie.
Mm.
He's basically saying it's a copy of the Museu de Arte de São Paulo, MASP, in Brazil. He even says that Iran doesn't have a real MOCAT.
Mm-hmm.
He also says that the City Theater is kind of a ripoff of an older design.
I mean, that brings up a big question. What do we even mean by originality in architecture?
Right.
Where's the line between being inspired by something and straight up copying it? Especially in a field where, ideas build on each other naturally.
Exactly. And of course, these are strong statements. They got a response from Kamran Diba, the architect who designed MOCAT.
Makes sense.
We've got discussions and analyses of both sides of this, which gives us a unique look into this whole controversy. So what we want to do today is unpack these criticisms and Diba's reaction. We want to understand what's really going on beneath the surface, not just say who's right or wrong.
Yeah, when you step back, this isn't just about two buildings or two guys. It's about architectural identity, how cultures influence each other, even what criticism itself really is.
Right. So let's start with Diba's side.
Okay.
He emphasizes that even if there are visual similarities, what matters is that MOCAT exists and the impact it's had on Iranian culture, education, the art scene there.
Yeah.
He even questions Shirdel using the word lie.
I mean, I can see why. That's a loaded word.
Yeah. What do you think is important about Diba's initial response?
Well, he immediately focuses on MOCAT's real-world impact, right?
Uh-huh.
He's not getting caught up in the visual comparison. He's saying, look, this building has cultural value. And by questioning that word lie, he's signaling that he thinks the criticism is not just inaccurate, but unfair.
Right, like it dismisses what the museum has done.
Exactly.
He also makes a point of saying that the skylight design in MOCAT, that industrial style, it wasn't totally his original idea.
Interesting.
It complicates this whole question of originality.
Definitely. I mean, it shows that even architects who create iconic buildings, they still draw on existing ideas, technologies. It's like he's anticipating accusations of copying. He's saying, hey, some things have a history.
Right. And Diba doesn't consider Shirdel's comments to be legitimate architectural critique. He sees it more as, well, venting and verbal abuse, according to the analysis. He thinks Shirdel's just trying to tear others down to make himself look better.
That's a pretty harsh assessment.
It is. It suggests that, to Diba, this isn't a respectful or constructive dialogue at all.
Right. He's saying this is personal, not an objective evaluation.
Exactly. What's interesting is that Diba admits his own work has been inspired by others. He even says that learning from others is a sign of professional maturity.
Yeah, that's a contrast to Shirdel's accusations. It's like Diba's saying, look, influence is normal. It's how architecture moves forward. And that kind of undermines Shirdel calling MOCAT a copy.
Right. Then Diba gets into specifics. He argues that the spatial layout, what architects call the plan, and the skylight design in the São Paulo Museum are quite different from MOCAT. He even mentions another project that came before the São Paulo Museum.
Yeah, so he's not just talking about the overall look. He's pointing to fundamental differences in the design. And when he emphasizes the plan, he's talking about the core organization of the building, how rooms and spaces relate to each other. He's saying, even if there are surface similarities, MOCAT's structure is unique. And mentioning that earlier project makes it harder to say it's a direct copy of the São Paulo Museum.
Right. And finally, he mentions Louis Kahn.
Taking it to a different level.
It does, yeah. How do you understand that reference?
Well, Louis Kahn is huge in architecture. He was all about light and form, so Diba mentioning him, it's probably to elevate his own work, like aligning it with this important lineage.
Okay, so that's Diba's side. Now, the psychological analysis of his reaction is interesting.
Okay.
One point is that Shirdel dismissing MOCAT, this massive project, as a lie, that's a direct attack on Diba's professional identity.
You can't separate an architect from their work.
Right.
It's personal.
And the analysis says that Diba's emotional language, calling it venting and verbal abuse, that shows psychological defense mechanisms kicking in.
Makes sense. If you feel like your core identity is being attacked, you're going to react defensively. It's human nature.
Right. There's also the idea of a compensatory reaction, like Diba might be trying to discredit Shirdel to make the criticism seem less valid.
Oh, yeah. If you can dismiss the person, you can dismiss their argument.
Exactly. The analysis also points out that Diba might genuinely feel that the criticism is unfair, that it's not based on a real architectural assessment, and that would explain why his response is more emotional than technical.
Absolutely. If you feel like someone's coming at you with a hidden agenda, it's hard to be purely objective.
Right. And here's where things get interesting. There's a potential clash between generations here, different ways of talking about architecture. Shirdel is part of a younger generation. They're known for being more direct, more outspoken in their criticism.
Right.
Diba comes from a time when architectural criticism was more academic, maybe more polite. This difference in communication styles can cause friction.
For sure. Different generations have different ideas about how to disagree.
Exactly. And there's the issue of Diba's senior status. In cultures like Iran, there's a strong emphasis on respecting elders, those who have achieved a lot.
Yeah.
Diba might be especially sensitive to public criticism from someone seen as not having earned that same level of recognition. It could feel like disrespect.
Yeah, the cultural context is so important here. It can add another layer of sensitivity.
Right. So, lots going on with Diba's reaction. Now let's look at the psychology of Shirdel's criticism.
Okay.
One point is that he seems to want to shake things up, challenge accepted ideas, bust myths. He uses really strong language, calling cat a lie. It's like he's trying to diminish its importance.
Yeah, it's very provocative. He's not pulling any punches. It's like he wants to force people to reevaluate something that they've just accepted.
Right, and the analysis says that his criticism might be a form of self-expression. He uses a lot of I statements.
That's interesting. It could mean that this is as much about Shirdel asserting himself, making his voice heard in the field.
Yeah. And there's also this idea of a self-enhancement strategy. In competitive fields, some people try to make themselves look better by tearing others down.
It's a common dynamic, unfortunately.
It is. And there's a possible clash between theoretical, abstract architecture and a more traditional approach. Shirdel, with his background in conceptual architecture and his Western experience, might see things differently from Diba, whose work is maybe more tied to Iranian traditions.
This is a classic tension in architecture globally, the balance between international influences and local heritage.
Right. And the analysis mentions Shirdel calling himself a leader in architecture. It suggests he wants to be influential. Maybe he's dissatisfied with the current establishment.
If you want to be a leader, you have to challenge the status quo.
Exactly. And there's this tactic of using provocative language. Those strong words might be a way to shock people, start a conversation about power dynamics in Iranian architecture, even if it upsets people.
Sometimes you need to use strong language to break through the noise.
Right. Finally, there's this idea of shadow projection. It's a bit more speculative, but it suggests that Shirdel might be projecting his own insecurities onto Diba.
Interesting. Like, maybe he's more derivative than he'd like to admit, so he accuses Diba of the same thing?
Right, so we've looked at the psychology of both sides. Now, the critical discourse analysis adds another layer.
Okay.
It points out the power structure in language. Diba, as an established figure, he represents the dominant discourse in Iranian architecture. It makes it hard to challenge him. Shirdel's trying to do just that.
Yeah, those with power and recognition have a huge influence on what's considered acceptable.
Right. And both architects are using strategies to legitimize themselves and delegitimize each other. Shirdel uses those comparisons to undermine Diba's originality. Diba calls Shirdel's comments abusive and emphasizes Emokat's cultural importance.
They're both playing the game,
They are.
trying to control how people see them and their opponent.
Right. They also use references to other works, ideas, to back up their arguments. Shirdel brings in international examples. Diba mentions Louis Kahn and traditional Iranian architecture.
It's all about building credibility.
And each architect is crafting a specific image of themselves and the other. Shirdel, he's the truth teller, fighting the establishment. Diba's the master, being attacked unfairly.
They're setting the narrative.
They are. And finally, there are the hidden ideologies in their word choices. Shirdel's words, lie, copy, fraud, lack of identity, they show that he values originality and thinks the system stifles creativity. Diba's focus on the museum's cost, its cultural role, its impact, it shows he values preserving achievements, tradition.
Their language reveals their values.
So to sum it up, Shirdel's discourse is critical. He's trying to expose flaws, disrupt the establishment. Diba is defensive. He wants to protect the institution. They have different beliefs. They're speaking to different audiences.
It's not just an argument about buildings. It's a clash of worldviews.
Exactly. So this whole exchange between Shirdel and Diba, it goes way beyond whether one building looks like another. It's about generational shifts, different ideas about criticism, the connection between an artist and their work, and the power of language.
It's a case study in how creative fields evolve.
It really is. And it shows how complex something as simple as a critique can be. All the psychology, the power dynamics.
And it makes you think about how to interpret criticism in your own life.
Exactly. These contrasting viewpoints, the intensity of it all, it gives us a glimpse into how architecture changes and how different values clash.
So here's something to think about. How important is strong criticism, even harsh criticism, for pushing boundaries in any field?
It's a good question. Consider this. How do these dynamics play out in other areas you're involved in? What does this tell us about giving and receiving criticism? How we defend our work? It's a huge topic, and we've only just scratched the surface.
Yeah, there's a lot more to explore.
Absolutely.
Definitely.
Thanks for joining us.
My pleasure.